Good evening, everyone. We're just going to give it one more moment while everyone gets in and gets situated. You heard that it's now being recorded, which is your 10-second warning, just to look presentable and whatnot. As usual, a couple of housekeeping notes. If you can keep your cameras on as much as possible. If you can indicate by your name where you're calling in from tonight. That's always nice to see for each other and for our discussion leader. Want to do the readings? That's my normal question before we get started. Show of hands. Everyone read? Very good. That means
liars, all of you.
A poll, you should see a poll popping up right now. When is the last time you read the Constitution, in whole or in part? Be honest. Less than a year ago, 1 to 5, 6 to 10, or you've never read it until now. I did not respond myself, but I would think the answer would be less than a year ago. Good. All right, I think we're just about set here. It looks like most of the participants that we're expecting are filed in. It looks like everyone's set to go. So thank you so much. It's week 3. Tonight's topic is the Founders Constitution. Last week, I gave everyone my email address and asked if you could please send along any questions or concerns you had about the program, and I received none. So I'm going to take that to mean that everyone's really enjoying this so far, and everyone understands the process and is enjoying our fellowship and enjoying the discussion thus far. But as always, I will put it again in the chat box again. And either during tonight's call or going forward, if you have any questions or concerns at all about our Burke to Buckley, please let me know offline. One other housekeeping note before we get started tonight. In the Q&A, or I should say the discussion portion up till now, I've been facilitating that. We're going to continue to ask you to use that raise hand function, but John will he'll manage that. He's a pro and he's done this before. So he will call on you and help facilitate the discussion. So I'll be his wingman. But again, please use that raise hand function after his remarks. Again, you can find that if you click the 3 dots in your little Hollywood square of yourself. You can use the raise hand function. And it should prioritize so he sees in what order you raised, and he will do his best to facilitate in order. All right, well, without any further ado, I see everyone's here. I'm going to introduce our discussion leader for tonight. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce you all to John Yu, who I'm sure you're going to really enjoy. He is one of our most popular discussion leaders, and I'm sure many of you know him from the Federalist Society, National Review events or writing, or the many appearances he makes on television. John came to the US from South Korea when he was an infant and was raised by parents that hated communism and admired Ronald Reagan. So I think you could say he had a very good home life and a very good childhood. John is the Emanuel Heller Professor of Law at the University of California at Berkeley, a visiting scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, and a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution. His 10th book, Defender-in-Chief, Trump's Fight for Presidential Power, was published last year. And his other books include Striking Power, How Cyber, Robots, and Space Weapons Change the Rules for War, Point of Attack, Preventive War, International Law, and Global Welfare, and Crisis in Command, A History of Executive Power from George Washington to George Bush. Professor Yu has published more than 100 articles in academic journals on subjects including national security, constitutional law, international law, and the Supreme Court. He also regularly contributes to the editorial pages of the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, LA Times, and of course, National Review. Professor Yu has served in all 3 branches of government. He was an official in the US Department of Justice, where he worked on national security and terrorism after 9/11 attacks. He served as general counsel of the US Senate Judiciary Committee. He's been a law clerk for the Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas and federal appeals judge Lawrence Silberman. He's been a visiting professor at Seoul National University in South Korea, the Interdisciplinary Center in Israel, Keio University in Japan, Trento University in Italy, the University of Chicago, and the Free University of Amsterdam. And trust me, this bio is almost done. You're all still with me. Very good. At Berkeley, he supervises the Public Law and Policy Program, the Korea Law Center, and the California Constitution Center. He also serves on the boards of the Pacific Legal Foundation, the Federalist Society Separation of Powers and Federalism Division, and the Universidad Científica del Sur Law School, as well as the Asia Pacific Law Institute at Seoul National University. Professor Yu graduated from Yale Law School and summa cum laude from Harvard University. Now, I looked it up, and the Yale Law School tuition is currently $66,000 a year. So tonight you are going to be subject to Professor Yu's brilliance for just a fraction of that cost. And with that, John, I turn it over to you.
Well, thanks, Chris, and thanks to National Review, and thanks to all of you for being here. And also particularly thank Lynn Gibson, who I've worked with on these programs for years now. And I only hope that all of you have the chance to join her and me on a National Review cruise one of these days back, hopefully in the future when we can have them again. And the Centers for Disease Control is not putting quotas in on how many people can get at the buffet table. So I'm going to run this class maybe a little differently. I don't have prepared remarks. Instead, what I thought is we would run the session like a law school class. So for those of you who are lawyers, I apologize for triggering any post-traumatic stress disorder that we're about to endure. You're about to endure. But what I mean by run it like a law school class is hopefully you will do most of the talking, and my job is really just to ask you questions that help provoke some thought. So to that end, you will see that you have below at the bottom of the screen in the reactions area, the hand waving function. So when I ask a question, if you'd like to take a stab at it, just raise your hand. My screen will prioritize you and raise you to the top of my screen so I can see you in the order that you raise your hands. And I will call on everyone who raises their hands. Or if you're uncomfortable with that and you want to try typing out something in the chat, I'll try to keep track of that as well and work those comments in, although it's not easy. Now, the worst possible thing that could happen is if nobody wants to talk or answer questions, then I will do what it is the prerogative of law professors do, is I will start randomly calling on people and asking you questions, what we call cold calling. And if even at that point you refuse to answer, then it is my right to start mocking your appearance and insulting your ancestors until you answer the question. That's what law school is all about. So I hope, and I've never really had a National Review session where it's come to that, but you always have to have a credible threat in order to provoke deterrence and get people to actually participate, as I know you want to. I don't think there are any other housekeeping things. I also will try to make sure that everybody does get a chance to talk. So, if I see some people who are just never saying anything and we're getting towards the end of the class, I always try to reserve the very end of class to call on people who have not spoken at all. So also when I call on you, tell us a little bit, tell us where you are, what you do, who you are, because unfortunately we're doing this virtually rather than in person. So let me start out by asking, why did our forefathers rebel against Great Britain? They had it pretty good in Great Britain. They were the freest men and women in the Western world at the time of the revolution, I would say. They were living in their colonies. It would take months and months for any kind of orders to get from Great Britain. They had had a period of benign neglect where they had elected people to their own assemblies, passed laws that governed themselves. They had, if you remember, what was the most important source of wealth at that time? Land. Unlike Europe, where people kill each other for thousands of years to get the littlest piece of land, in America, they had endless expanses of the great source of wealth. All they had to do to get more wealth was just go a little farther out of town, which is sort of like what Phoenix, Arizona is like, I'm told. you had endless amounts of the wealth of the old world present in the new world. You had enormous political freedom. Think about what would have happened if the United States had never rebelled from the United Kingdom. Suppose America and England and had stayed one country. The Germans never would have messed with anybody. America and Great Britain together would have stopped the World War. Slavery would have ended earlier. Think about all the good that would have occurred if England and America had stuck together these 200 years or so. So tell me, why did our forefathers, more than 2.25 centuries ago, ruin the party? Why did they rebel? Why did they break off their ties? Was it just to preserve slavery, as the New York Times would have you believe? We've got a ringer here. Dan Kolke, former judge and former counsel to Governor Pete Wilson and a sometime lunch partner of mine. I didn't even know you snuck in here. Dan, go ahead.
I snuck in, John. All right. So while this was not, I think, part of our reading, I will tell you what I recall. As a result of the 7 Years' War, also known as the French and Indian Wars, the British government not only tried to limit the right of the American settlers to move beyond a certain line, but Great Britain had built up a great amount of debt from the 7 Years' War and was trying to collect and recover that debt, partly from the North Americans. And they started with various taxes. We know about the tax on tea, among others, the Stamp Act tax. But then when the Bostonians threw out the tea at the Boston Tea Party, the British responded with the coercive acts, and those resulted in British troops, as I recall, in Boston Harbor. And so all of a sudden, all the great freedoms you were talking about, John, the fact of all this land and the ability to move westward to gain more land was being limited. And the settlers were being imposed these taxes that they felt were unjust. They, in fact, themselves had paid a price in the French and Indian Wars themselves. I mean, Washington had one of his biggest defeats during one of the incursions that he led during the French and Indian Wars, although he learned quite a bit from that experience. And I mean, one of Washington's great skills and talents was that he was able to learn from his prior mistakes and was willing to shift his strategies as he learned from experience.
So it was, let me pause you there, Dan. So Dan says, it actually is what we learned in school, taxation. We rebel because of taxation. It's as if we should rebel now against the IRS. Not a bad idea, Dan. But it's, Dan says, look, the British Empire starting to cost a lot of money. Starting to cost a lot of money in North America. So the British central government starts imposing more taxes on the colonies. Right? And so we learned in grade school, the Boston Tea Party and things like that. And the Stamp Act. Those are sort of the popular, easy to remember representations of growing control by Parliament in London over the colonies. Good. Kirsten Burkhart, you were next. But go ahead and unmute yourself and then tell us where you are and who you are.
There we go.
Good.
All right, I'm unmuted. I am a professor of early American literature here in Durham,
Jesus
North
Christ,
Carolina.
this is like some kind of murderer's row of, I'm going to have to talk to Lynn. There's got to be some I want ignorance. I don't want everybody who already knows everything in this class. Okay, go ahead, professor.
So I would say as a student of the Reformation and Calvinism and Puritanism in particular, the really easy answer to this question is Providence. But that's the easy answer.
I would rebel if I had to live in Providence, Rhode Island too. What a terrible place. But what has Providence got to do with this?
But I mean, Providence with a capital P.
Yes.
But I think the larger answer is is more the
But,
pragmatic
I'm sorry,
one.
but you mean providence? You just mean luck, fortune.
No, providence is much more than just
Yes,
luck
what do you
or
mean?
fate. Providence is the idea that, according to the Westminster Catechism of Faith, that God in his omnipotence and omniscience has not ordained everything. Now that's where it gets confused with predestination, but oversees everything that happens. So to the Puritan mind, both the good aspects of life and the terrible outcomes of life were both providential.
Mhm.
I mean, that they stem from this idea of God's inherent and intrinsic goodness.
Right.
So, they would have understood that. I mean, just as a small example, for the Pilgrims, who were known as the Separatists, when they came over on the Mayflower, a little known fact about the Mayflower is that it was initially a wine transporter. And
That
so
seems
a lot of
quite
that
appropriate
wine
to
had
America.
sloshed in all of the wood. And most of the people who died on passages died because of disease and et cetera. And due to all that wine disinfecting the wood in the Mayflower, most of them survived and until they got to Plymouth Rock. But
Huh.
so, I
That's
mean,
a kind
that's
of,
how they would have understood
yeah,
providence.
that's a kind of hydroxychloroquine approach to.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
You
but what does
had
that have to
say
do with
that,
the
didn't you?
revolution? So, but seriously, just to press you a little bit, how does that produce the revolution? I agree with you, right? The people who came were different, right? They were the dissenters, right? If they fit in to the old world, they never would have left. So,
Right.
for anyone who's
Right.
interested,
And
there's
so
great historian Bernard Balin wrote a book called Voyagers to the West, and he
Yep.
actually tried to see who came to America.
Right.
And a lot of them were misfits, second sons. People weren't inheriting anything, entrepreneurs, but people who did not fit into the hierarchy of the British Empire, the Western Europe.
Exactly.
How's that produce the revolution?
I mean, I think the simple answer to that is that it was a bunch of misfits. And I say that in the most affectionate way. But I think also that very Calvinistic ideal that salvation is totally individual. That is the idea that really bred, or the concept that really bred, that individual rights are preeminent.
Good. That's I was glad you got there. So Dan looks at the power relationship between the colonies and London. Kirsten is saying there's also something different about the way Americans understand themselves with their focus on individual rights, which, right, read the Declaration of Independence. They think it comes from God. They don't think the rights are granted to them by the king, which is what people in the rest of the world think.
Right.
So this is a second different possible explanation for the revolution.
Which is very much sort of a transition from Reformation Reformation theology. The heart of that was that you don't need the priest as an intermediary. Your salvation is a completely individual thing. So, I mean, it makes sense that, there are a number of historians that say there would have been no revolution if there had not been any great awakening.
Good. So there's this, right? If you look at things that make America different, dare we say exceptional, right? American exceptionalism. One of the things that many people have pointed to from the beginning is how religious Americans are.
Yes.
Even today, even though we complain about the decline in religion in the United States, it is a lot faster in Western Europe than it's been here, the decline.
Oh, yeah.
And religiosity has always been something that makes America different. Let me go to Johnny Davis then in Alexandria, are you in?
Yes, Alexandria, Virginia, sir. I'm a Liberty University professor in the
you gotta be
government.
No more professors talking. No, go ahead.
That's incredible. And I'm a National Guard JAG.
Oh my God.
And
so you've been to, wait, so you've been to law school too?
Yes. Well, and I've been to the seminary as well. And so the seminary helps inform what my answer is going to be as well, because I double down on what Christine already said. The two great awakenings are the key to everything, because that's your operational environment, bringing in my military side of things. You had, America was already much more individualistic already, because it was the rebellion, Scots, and all that who came over here to begin with. But then through the Great Awakenings, they become far more religious than England, which is becoming less and less religious. At the same time, America's becoming more religious, most importantly, in a very strong individualistic way, so that it's not just Jefferson. The average American is thinking about, we're made in the image of God. That gives us our rights. Then bungling King George comes along and once he starts imposing the taxes, we resist.
By the way, can I pause you there? Because Dan's point was, it wasn't the king. We have this myth, it's us against King George III, but it was really Parliament, right? It was an elected Parliament that imposed those taxes. But go ahead.
Well, but
ultimately, King George comes in.
Look at Jefferson, though. Jefferson keeps stressing the role of the king, and when I get to the rest of the picture, that's why he ultimately stresses the king, because it's the king with a compliant parliament. They're both working together. North is all on board with what's happening. They're not fighting each other over it. But the reason Jefferson stresses the king is the other things that's in the 27 complaints about how we start violating the search and seizures and all those various civil liberties that are being violated, with the ultimate climax being that the king illegally uses the British military to attack the colonies. They defend themselves, and even after the fighting starts at Lexington Concord, they still don't declare independence. See, I ultimately said they didn't even rebel, and that they kept pleading, let's negotiate. The king said, stick it, bow the knee. And only after a year of that did they finally declare independence, basically once the king had given them no choice. Now, a king with a parliament, you're right, that was absolutely with him, because the parliament could have stopped all this, but they did not do so. But the Jefferson, with good reason, stresses the king because of all this operational stuff, all the abuses through the military that the king did that. That's why Jefferson emphasizes that, though they're both guilty parties in this. And so ultimately, it was the ultimate act of self-defense, but it isn't just about the political disagreement. England and America were culturally going into such different directions. You see it in Washington's own right. He talks about how outraged he is with the lack of honor of British merchants and all this. So the Americans also have the backdrop of they're basically worried that if they stay tied to England, they're going to go down the same degradation path that England is going. And they're outraged by what they're seeing in England because they see it as so honorable. And even those who weren't strongly religious still had a greater sense of honor than what was going on in England. You even saw it happening in the Revolutionary War. The generals all the time on the British side were having mistresses, even sleeping with the wives of loyalists on their own side. Washington, on the other hand, wouldn't even let his officers curse in front of him. So there's a huge morality chasm that was separating the two. And actually, it's one of the reasons Washington won the war.
Okay, well, I think British generals are always sleeping with anything they can get their hands on, of course, in every war. But so let me summarize a different explanation. So Dan's explanation is a sort of political constitutional explanation that didn't really depend on religion, right? It was a fight about a central government and periphery, right? And then Kirsten and Johnny Davis's explanations are, you might say they're more social, that the revolution was inevitable because America and Great Britain were different. I just want to point out, think about how unbelievable it was. There had never been a revolution before, at least not in the modern times. There might have been revolutions in ancient Greece and efforts in Rome. This is really the first effort of a subset of people to declare independence from the larger one in modern history, and so it's quite unusual and unprecedented. Jeff Gardner, my screen says you're next.
Well, thank you. So let me first say,
where are you?
Let me say I'm from Cleveland, Ohio. Can you hear me?
Yep.
All right, so I'm talking to you from Cleveland, Ohio. It's rainy here. Second of all, let me just point out that I'm not a professor. I'm a very simple man. I'm just a statistician.
Oh God, it's getting worse and worse. Statistician. Okay, so for the next 2 minutes, please speak in a language no one can understand.
Yes, exactly. So I think what I would try to do is kind of articulate what Kirsten and Johnny are saying in slightly different terms. It's not that I disagree, but I feel like the religious aspect is somewhat more accidental than central to the fundamental question as to why we rebel. But I think at the core of it is combination of the economics, the taxation issue, but I think more fundamentally, it's about the source of authority. Who has the authority to decide what goes down politically, what can be bought into from a policy standpoint? And I think the religious aspect kind of informs the thinking on that question, but I think fundamentally it's about what is the ultimate source of authority? And if King George really does have divine authority, then it should be properly exercised. But if he exercises that authority in a way that's suspect or brings questions into one mind, or to state it another way, runs counter to natural law, right? Then there's something deficient in a moral sense. And I think Johnny touched upon that. And that's where I think the agreement lies. But I think it's fundamentally about what is the ultimate source of authority. And I think the founders more or less reached the conclusion that ultimately the authority comes from those God-fearing citizens and individuals who recognize and are in tune with the moral law, the natural law, right? And therefore have the authority to be able to say, this is how society should be governed, this is how taxation should be executed, so on and so forth. So that would be a very simple layman's way, at least in my terms, in terms of how I think we arrived at that conclusion.
Yeah, no, this is people who and this was a great revolution in the study of the revolution, was in the 1960s, people started saying, but before the 1960s, the explanation was purely economic. People thought, historians said, oh, the revolution was because a bunch of the rich people in the colonies were starting to have their wealth taken away by Britain. They got the poor people to join them to overthrow London, but they wanted to stay rich and the elite stayed the same. In the late 1960s, historians, and we're still living in that period, came to the fore who said, no, the reason is ideological. It's about, this is Jeff's point, it's about ideas. Ideas drove the revolution. And so can you believe this, that the founders had a rebellion, they risked their lives and what they called their fortunes and their sacred honor to rebel against a faraway government because of an idea about where does authority come from. Even if the British imposed the taxes they wanted to, they were not very heavy. Right? I wish we could pay the taxes that they were trying to impose on us compared to the ones we pay today. Okay? They're very slight compared to what we're paying now. But it was the idea behind it, right? The intellectual reasons for it. And so, as Jeff says, part of that is, right, they see the source of authority in the people, not from divine right of a king. They see the right coming to the people because that's the natural law. This is a big break from the way things were done in the British Empire. And so they have an intellectual explanation. Intellectual Origins of the American Revolution is the name of the great book by, again, this fellow named Bernard Bailyn. So probably not surprisingly, just to move along, after the revolution, states start to create their own constitutions, right? Not surprisingly, they create a very weak central government. You know, people forget we're living under Constitution version 2.0. Version 1.0 was called the Articles of Confederation, which was a very weak central government and quite a failure, which requires us to replace it with the one we have now that's proposed in 1787. But from 1776 to 1787, we have what are called revolutionary state constitutions. And we have a weak central government and the Articles of Confederation. And it is the Constitution that is a reaction to that experience. So maybe move next to ask, what do you see in the Constitution that tells you what again, if this is about intellectual origins, or it's about how Americans are different, or if it's about struggles for power between different levels of government, as Dan started us off with. What do you see in our current Constitution and the commentary, the readings you had, that reflects their experience between that, including the revolution and the period right after? What were they trying to do in the Constitution compared to what they had just lived through? So Alexis Lavin, I can't see your face.
I'm so sorry. I'm waiting for the arrival of a new computer with a working camera.
You know, students have all kinds of fake reasons they give for
Well,
not
you know,
complying with the rules. That
I've
is
heard
one
them
I
all as
often
well.
hear.
I'm so sorry to tell you, I'm a college professor as well. So,
Oh my gosh.
if I may,
Go
I'd
ahead.
like to address the last question we were
Oh,
on, if
yeah,
that's all
please,
right.
go ahead.
What I find to be one of the driving forces behind the revolution, in spite of the fact that it was a complete break from history in that they were pursuing independence from their mother country, is I think a fundamental driving force behind it was their conservatism. You know, they were saying, these are our rights as Englishmen. You have no right to deprive us of these without due process in our elected government. And so what they were trying to do wasn't to reinvent the wheel or to launch an entirely new form of government. What they were trying to do was preserve the rights they felt they should have. Now, I think,
okay, let me pause you there, because you're doing me such a favor. You are doing what's called a segue from one topic to the next. I love it. And this is the segue, because it is exactly one thing that it makes the American Revolution unique amongst the great revolutions. So if you look at the great revolution, there's the American Revolution, right? There's the Russian Revolution, there's the Chinese Revolution. The last two didn't end up too well, did they? The first, oh, and also I forgot, the French Revolution. So 3 out of 4 revolutions don't seem such a good prospect, do they? The one thing that makes the American Revolution different is that, as Alexa said, it was a conservative revolution. If you read these discussions, if you read what the founders, the revolutionaries said, they thought they were rebelling to restore something from the past, right? They, as Alexa said, they said that their rights were taken away. Several of you said that. The rights were invaded, taken away. They want what was once theirs. Dan mentioned the freedom, right, that they had from British rule. So this is really, if you leave with anything, this is important to leave with, is that the American Revolution and the Constitution are backwards looking. That's what we call it. The French, Russian, Chinese revolutions, what do they all share? They have this desire to wipe away the past, to remake mankind itself, right? All 3 revolutions believe in a certain pliability of man, right? That they can change human nature. It is very Rousseauian. The idea is like tradition and institutions have oppressed man. The American Revolution is the exact opposite. And the American Revolution is, the past is not so bad, right? We just want to go back there. And then they said, I'm talking about politically and constitutionally, not economically and socially, where several of you are right. There was a lot of radicalism in terms of economic and social change. But in terms of intellectual, constitutional, political thought, it's backwards looking. So then this is why it's a segue, is where do you see that in the Constitution? Is the Constitution really backwards looking? Is it really conserving? As you know, that's what right? That's what gives us that's the root for conservative. How does the Constitution do that? Can I turn to Bill McNally next? He was next. I'm sorry if I'm reading out, but the computer is controlling everything. It tells me what order to call on people. So Bill McNally.
Yeah, well, thank you.
And you're in Chicago?
In Chicago, right. Illinois.
Good.
And I'm not a professor.
Good. So you've actually made a
So
living.
In the Constitution, they were sent off to Philadelphia and just to kind of amend their Articles of Confederation. And this group decided, no, they were going to rewrite the whole Constitution. And, they emphasized several things. One was keeping colonies, but calling them states. And then they created free trade within them so they wouldn't fight with each other over trade. And then they set rules for borders, and so they wouldn't all fight over the Northwest Territories, allowed for the creation of states. And, focused on Eventually, the Bill of Rights was put in place because a lot of the states wouldn't sign the original document until there was an agreement with the Bill of Rights so that they could have further protections. And then one of the big things is they funded a Navy, but they would not fund an Army for more than a year.
2 years.
Because they were afraid that the Army would be taken over by the executive branch and take over the country. So they were real leery of the Army, which they saw what was going on in Europe, saw all the battles between countries for all that time. So they tried to set it up so they could kind of live in peace.
So
those are some of the things that.
Yeah. So
and it was the age. It was the age of. You mentioned it was the age of land as the wealth, but it was mercantilism at that time. It was in Europe. The mercantilism meant enriching the monarchy. And along comes Adam Smith, who was about the same time, and he said, "There's another way." So, like Hamilton wanted to create an economic environment, and he put in trade laws to protect the rising manufacturing sector. Whereas before that, Britain was taking advantage of the colonies to protect their manufacturing, and to the detriment of the colonies' manufacturing. So those are some of the things they built in.
Let me summarize. So if you look at some of the powers that the Constitution gives, it wants to make clear that the national government controls foreign affairs and national security, the creation of a military. Actually, it's interesting. The Constitution doesn't mention control of the borders. We've just always assumed it had to have that.
Well, they were all fighting over the borders, though.
Yeah, they were fighting over the borders. But
the colonies were.
Yes, sir. But the Constitution does not actually mention the word border or control of it. Or immigration, actually. It only mentions naturalization. It's a great gap, actually, in the Constitution. But we've assumed it's a federal power, always from the beginning. Yeah. The Constitution also gives the federal government power, as you said, over interstate commerce and foreign commerce. Mm-hmm. So you have this national economic control. But at the same time, as you say, it creates, it doesn't create, they pre-exist the Constitution, are the states. And if you look at the Constitution, it is written in the exact opposite way that state constitutions are written. If you look at your own state constitution, which most of you probably never have, unless you have insomnia, you will find that they actually don't list many powers. They just assume the state government has all government power. The federal Constitution is different. It lists what we call enumerates the powers of the federal government. And the federal government cannot exercise any powers other than those listed. Everything else is assumed to go to the states. And so for most of the things of everyday life, the states control criminal law, crime, that's in the state hands, family law, property. Most of the day-to-day interactions with government that we have are in the hands of the states. But you still have a much more powerful national government than you had under the Articles, which didn't really control any of this. So Ben H. from, your name is not Ben H. Ashland, I assume. It's Ben H. from Ashland. You're on mute. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess we've come close to an answer. We've got a lot of the answer to your most recent question, I think. But right, the reasons for the revolution are reflected in the Constitution in some pretty important ways, which include limiting federal power and making power accountable to the people, right? And also, I would say, diffusing power in a way, right?
How does it do that?
So, I mean, Federalist 10 is really thinking about factions, and partly it's just by, forming government that governs a big, diverse nation, right?
So let me that's very good. Let me ask you though, based on some of the reasons you heard about the revolution, Why are we diffusing power so much? You know, Bill points out there's differences between what's federal, what's state. You just said quite rightly that there's diffusion of power even within the federal government. If you thought your revolution was to throw off the British yoke, and you thought everybody had natural rights, and you thought that the people, you know, were the highest source of authority, why would you diffuse power at all? Wouldn't you trust the people to make all the right decisions? Why would you limit yourself, right? That's what you're doing. You're limiting yourself. Why would you do that, Ben?
It's a really interesting question, because there certainly are a lot of people who have great faith in human nature. But,
Yes.
you know, when you've seen humans misbehave in positions of power, then you have at least some reasons to doubt whether they will always behave. And of course, you know, the Federalists, the writers of the Federalist are quite clear. We can't expect people to always make wise or public interested decisions.
Why? That's good. So you're right. The Federalist Papers say, right, there's a famous phrase, you know, if men were angels, there'd be no need for government. There'd be no need for constitutions. And then he says, but they're not angels. Right? Why? Where do they have that view? We were just a few minutes ago, we had a gallery of professors saying how great people were, how wonderful individuals are. What happened?
Having individual rights is not the same as being wonderful yourself, you know. And I do think religion played a role here. I mean, it's an interesting. This question of human nature is really interesting for me, because I actually study Confucianism. I'm the philosophy professor, right?
If you learn Confucianism, then you should just take down everything I say and not speak, because you're the student. So let's move on to the next guy. No, but go ahead.
You know, interestingly, that's a cultural practice, but it's not the way that the original Confucians thought about things. They were mavericks.
Yes, that's true.
They were extremely critical of the rulers of their time.
Yes.
They were very free thinkers, even while sort of, I mean, they wanted to sustain traditions, and they wanted to work with and refresh traditions. They had a very interesting relationship with the past, but you know, Mencius.
Okay, no more about Confucius. Let's get back to, let's work on Madison and Hamilton.
But religiously, I mean, there was a pretty widely distributed view that humans are by nature prone to sin, right? And I do think that's a really important influence at the time. But there's no shortage of just basic experiential evidence, if you're paying attention at all, that humans are prone to sin. And
what had happened? You mentioned Federalist number 10. What does Federalist number 10 say had happened after the revolution? Right? You mentioned it earlier. What had happened during the revolution and after that required the diffusion of power? Do anybody remember? You mentioned it earlier. What did remember you said the word faction.
Faction, right?
Yeah, what had happened with factions?
There's a special danger from majority factions, but
he said people form factions. And then when they form factions, those factions try to take over the government and use it, right, to give themselves benefits, right? What is the modern version of special interest politics? Madison is actually often Federalist number 10 is considered the greatest contribution of American political science, because, right, this is where the theory of interest group politics really makes its appearance. So he says, today it's almost like, well, tell us stuff we don't know, right? But when he wrote it, he was saying, look, you will have, the people can't be necessarily trusted because a faction of them will take over the government and abuse the powers of the government, abuse the name of the people to give themselves special benefits. And so one question is just, right, you know, Ben said, and that, so if you're afraid of that, you make it harder for any one faction to take over. Question to ask, I don't know if this is what Robert T. Pearl River has to say, but I'll turn to him next. Why do people form factions? Why do we have special interest groups? Why do they seek to take over the government, right? You could say maybe Madison was right, maybe he was wrong, but right, the Constitution does seem to reflect this concern. Go ahead.
Well, first of all, I'm in Lower Hudson River Valley outside New York City. And,
Roosevelt country.
a little bit south of there and just north of New Jersey. And I'm a retired certified public accountant. I've had experience in the public sector, the private sector, and the nonprofit sector. And if I could just backtrack a little bit to your original question about the Constitution itself, what struck me that it was a mix of truly being a revolution and also conservative. Revolutionary in the sense, and I have to preface by saying I'm not well versed with British history, so that my stereotype is a monarchy that has too much control and power. And the idea in this former 13 colonies, to which, by the way, they thought there were 13 separate nations, which meant that each nation could have its own monarch or
well, that's a much debated question, actually, that gets us into a civil war. But let's bracket that for now and continue on, please. Yes.
But just to mention that, so my view of the Constitution was, hey, we don't want a king. Even though they were worried about Washington, some people were, after being president, that he would become monarch. But the idea of, okay, we can't have that concentration of power in one person. Then the idea of being a conservative document is that, well, we couldn't get these 13 independent nations to get together in an agreement over the issue of slavery. And we would have to preserve that somehow and give discretion to each future state to decide the question themselves. So I see this as a mix. And out of that, I think it's natural that you would have fractions, even over the slavery issue, as we are all well aware. Certain colonies had many more enslaved people than other colonies and had economic reasons for doing that, aside from religious reasons for doing that. And you would have fractions, which...
Hey, wait, let me pause you there. So
sure.
You say factions arose because some people had slaves, some people didn't have slaves, some people had different religions. It's almost a natural reflection of the diversity of the countries, all its different societies, the different geographies, etc. Naturally, the factions. That's your point. That's a very modern explanation for factions. I just point out that's not Madison's explanation for factions. I'm not sure whether Madison's right, but Madison has a very different explanation for factions.
Yeah. Well, the way I look at it is how I look at it, that fractions come out of a natural being of commonality of interest. And just to jump to the abolition period, where we had many Protestant churches divided in the 1840s over the very issue of slavery because of their interpretation of theology differed, a conservative versus a more liberal. And they united over that on a religious basis. So true, I'm not well versed what Madison has to say about.
But it was on the reading list. You didn't do the reading, did you? Okay, I'll tell you what it said. Madison says in Federalist number 10, he says factions are inevitable. And it goes, see, I thought you would really like this because he said because of differences in the amount of property they have. Now, right, because you said slaves, land, different kinds of businesses, so on. So why do people have differences in property? So Madison even goes farther back and he says, because people are different in their faculties and talents. This is interesting. He says this, so he doesn't say it's because of inherited wealth, right? It's because people have different abilities and those abilities produce, right, different levels of property in society. And then he predicts interest groups, what he calls factions, will form around those different interests created by their differences in property, which are created really by their differences in capability. Right? It's interesting. It doesn't have to do with people being good, inherently good or inherently evil, right? It also almost like bring us back to Dan Kolke's, saying at the beginning, it's really about government and its design in a way. And notice also he thinks factions are inevitable. We can't escape it.
May I disagree over that point?
Yeah, you already disagreed before. I was just saying Madison and you have different views of where
Yeah,
interests come from.
I'm not a
Let me
disagreeable
pause.
person.
Let me just why don't you
Can-
let me move to their other people in the queue. Let me move
Well,
on
if I
to the
could
next.
give the reason.
Sir, how about
Because-
this? Sir, why don't
because
you
during the
type it?
colonial
Sir,
period-
why don't you type it in the
colonial
chat
period,
box? Okay, could you keep it brief? Sir? Keep
Yeah,
it
I am.
brief? Okay, go ahead,
brief.
keep it brief.
During the colonial period, many people came to this nation, a country, and they were given land by the monarchy. It wasn't based on merit, independent merit. It was based on other considerations.
Okay, thank you very much. I was going to get to the other people. Howard Sporn. Unmute yourself.
I'm sorry, I wanted to answer a question from before. I think you were asking, what was the ideological background behind the Constitution? And I wanted to say there's sort of a paradox that I see. The founding of America, the American Revolution, the writing the Constitution, those were all done during the Enlightenment period. And the Enlightenment, was a time of new ideas. Two of the greatest political philosophers of the time were the Englishman, John Locke, and the Frenchman, Baron de Montesquieu. And both of them had an enormous impact on the founding fathers. I think that I would say that Locke's idea, here his big issue was rights, human rights, individual rights, natural rights. So I would say that the Bill of Rights in the Constitution could at least partly trace to him and his idea of Locke. The bulk of the Constitution, in which there's the separation of powers, the different branches, the executive and so forth, that was laid out by Montesquieu. But here's the paradox. In both cases, Locke and Montesquieu were not saying, oh, here's some great new ideas. No, they were saying, this is the way it's been done. Locke was saying, man lives in the state of nature, and then governments are created to protect rights. I don't know how true that is all over the world, but at least in England, where he was, that was the basic idea. I mean, there was sort of a proto Bill of Rights at the time of Locke. And what else was I?
I think that's those both the points are very the Locke and Montesquieu are
but
considered the most influential thinkers.
He said it's a shame that France is not like England. Look how wonderful England is with its separation of powers. So both of them were saying this is the way things already are.
Yeah.
It as new ideas or as old ideas as represented by
actually
them.
what people have said about both of them is that they claimed to be describing how England worked, but in fact England did not work that way. So one thing that our founders do, again, to diffuse power remarkably, is to create a separation of powers. Right? We're well accustomed to it now: a president, a Congress, and a judiciary. Montesquieu is actually quite wrong. There is no separation of powers in England at this time. Really, there's never really been a separation of powers in England in the sense that we understand it. So the thing is, you're quite right. Montesquieu claims that's the way Britain was. The amazing thing is that the founders took this idea, and it really was just an untested idea, and they put it into the Constitution. It is the first real try at the separation of powers by any nation. It's quite remarkable. But they are so worried about this idea of abuse of government power by the federal government that they adopt this theory of division that really hadn't been tried before. It's quite an experiment. Then Locke, I quite agree. Locke also, right? He writes a famous treatise, right? The two treatises on government. He writes about how the powers of Parliament, right? He sees Parliament as being all powerful.
Oh, what I wanted to say about him before was Locke wrote the second treatise, maybe both treatises, but the second particularly, in order to justify the Glorious Revolution.
Yeah.
So he again was saying, this is the way things are.
Yeah.
Not
so
someday we'll have this.
he wants to justify the idea of a sort of republic, right? Rather than absolute monarchy. does our Constitution actually adopt, right, the democracy that Locke describes in the second
Well, no,
treatise?
of course not. We're
Yeah.
they make the distinction between republic and democracy.
Right. We have a Senate, right? We have, right. If we were following Locke, at the very least, we would just had a House of Representatives. And you can argue about how they're chosen and the districts and so on, but there'd be no Senate in a system that's supposed to derive its power directly from the people. The Constitution creates a second. And notice the Senate, how powerful it is. It not only is necessary to pass laws, it's also necessary to confirm cabinet officers and judges and to make treaties, right? And to make constitutional amendments. The Senate is part of every major decision of the federal government. So you're right, but it's very interesting how they both look at these thinkers, adopt some of their ideas, but some of the ideas are quite radical for the time. Richard Fountain, where are you?
I am in Plainview, Texas, and I am a pianist, which makes me somewhat different, but I'm also a professor, so there's a strike.
What is going on with you people? Even music professors are getting in on this.
There's a few of us out there. But anyway, I think the faction idea is really interesting to me because having sort of been born, raised, lived, worked in the middle of the country, not in the original part of the United States, one of the genius things I've thought about how they set up the Constitution is not only to balance factions as best they could in terms of the landed interests literally, but also as the country expanded, how do we retain that balance when we have forces and resources and new things that we don't even know about that are going to come about? They saw this country growing by leaps and bounds. I don't know if they originally thought of it crossing the entire continent or not, but regardless, they thought of it as being something much, much bigger than it was at the time. And trying to figure out a way to balance, this part of the country, very different resources in very different places. So even when, voting was more restricted, it wasn't, universal suffrage back then. Certainly we had a different way of, selecting who could vote. And even when you mentioned the Senate, the Senate was not directly elected until 1912 or something. I can't remember when it changed, fairly recently. Just the genius of it in trying to balance all of those different interests and have this, enormous growth of land and different sorts of people coming in. I've found to be just, incredibly fascinating.
Actually, this is a really good point that follows on the last point, because Montesquieu thought, and Madison's Federalist Number 10 and the Constitution directly respond to this concern. Montesquieu and most philosophers of the day did not think that democracy or a republic, a democratic republic, could survive in a large country, right? As you just said, Richard, the country has expanded enormously in terms of territory, population, and wealth, right? If you look at the people who wrote back in the day, they thought that's what happened to the Romans, and then it collapsed into a monarchy because a democracy could not govern such expanse in people, land, and wealth. Madison's Federalist Number 10 turns that on its head too. Right? What does Madison say in response to that age-old worry? Right, this is a worry that people had had since the Greek city-states, that democracy could only survive in a small community. How does Madison respond to that? Right, Madison says, and this is, we've kind of attacked interest group politics, but actually Madison says, no, interest group politics are going to save us in the end. The bigger the country becomes, the more interests there will be. And the more interest there will be, the more the interests will fight with each other. So Madison loves interest group politics. We complain about all the time, this common way to, how do you get elected to Congress? You say, I'm going to go to Washington and clean out that swamp filled with interest groups that are, right, paralyzing the government. Madison says, no, that's what we want. We want all those interest groups to paralyze each other. So the bigger the country, the safer will be from, right? He turns Montesquieu on his head, actually quite clearly rejects Montesquieu on this point. And that's another contribution of Federalist Number 10. Who knows if he's right or wrong, But the idea was that a bigger country would actually be safer for republicanism, not a threat. So let's see, Paul D. from Naperville.
Yeah, which is suburban Chicago, and I'm a business coach, not a professor.
Good for you. Finally, a real American.
A couple comments quickly on some of your questions. One was about conservative, and focus on the word conserve. Obviously the difference between European conservative was not wanting to conserve a monarchy, but conserve what works. And so the Constitution has elements in it to basically force change to be slow. It's hard to legislate. House, Senate, President. Later on, not in the Constitution, filibuster rule. That all makes it hard to legislate. It's hard to change the Constitution. And your other question was why is it important to diffuse power? I think it's for two reasons. One is to eliminate the chance of tyrants, monarchs or pseudo monarchs with too much power, and the tyranny of the majority, which others have mentioned already.
So notice again how different that is than the other revolutions. And people often say this is such a strange thing that Americans are exceptional in their paranoid approach to government. Right? We are afraid of government. So much, though, as Paul says, that we have dispersed the power because we're afraid the government's going to tyrannize us. What do the French, Russian, Chinese revolutions say? They say the people, the majority, are the highest good. You would not want to put anything in their way. You would not want to divide power, right? You would want to concentrate all the power in the government if it's really controlled by the people, because the people do no wrong, right? They would say it's the old institutions that have perverted or distorted the voice of the people. It's very different than the American Constitution. The American Constitution and the American Revolution, they're afraid of government. So that some of you who read in politics, you'll recognize this. This was a famous book written by a fellow named Richard Hofstadter, and he called it something like the paranoid style of American politics. And it does seem to be an echo ever since the founding time, this fear of the government. Whereas, you talk to people in Europe and Asia, something say, why would you fear the government? You're just afraid of yourself, right? Because you are the government. It's a very different attitude. And so that's another good reason why you would have a separation of powers, or you would have federalism, because you don't trust anybody. And that's I would say, an interesting, exceptionally American perspective. Is it Helen Raleigh? And then Mucho Langbert.
Hi, Professor Yu. Thank you for having me. Thank you for being on. So to answer a bunch of questions that you raised earlier, I think what make our U.S. Constitution so unique was the founders' sobering realization of the human nature on several levels. One is we are all capable of doing evil things, especially when we have power. So just like the saying later, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. So when we're individual giving power, we can all be at the brink of tyranny. Another thing is sometimes we let our passion rule rather than reason and logic. And the other three revolutions you mentioned, the French Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, the Russian Revolution, they are the bigots who harvest the passion from the masses and use it to obtain and stay in power, or turn those revolutions.
Let me interrupt you there, because that's a very important point, which becomes very clear in some of the other Federalist Papers, which were not assigned, but you see brief mentions of it here and there. And I want to emphasize it because, it was the founders could not actually say, we distrust the people, right? So you'll notice they distrust factions. They don't say we distrust the people, because the people are sovereign, right? They say that several times, people are sovereign. So how do they get out of this quandary? One thing they say is what Helen just said. Well, the people can act out of passion rather than reason. They repeat that contrast over and over again, passion on the one hand, reason on the other. And so they said, it's possible for the people to act rashly, to be deceived by demagogues, to not see their true long-term interest. But since they're sovereign, they ultimately have to trust in the people, but when they act out of cool rationality. And so you could say that's also part of the constitutional design. Right? So Washington, I think, was explaining the Senate to somebody, and he said, and the House, he said, the House is like the teacup with the hot tea and it spills over, and the Senate is like the saucer, and you let the tea cool and then you drink it. This shows you how strange 18th century Americans were. They're all drinking tea out of the saucers. I don't get that, but that's Washington's explanation. It's got to have some part of the government that slows everything down, right? That so, and the idea, several you mentioned, slowing things down, acting out of consensus. It was to make sure that the people were acting out of reason, not passion. But you didn't go so far as to so distrust the people that you disable them from acting altogether, right? You just want them to take their time. So you have two houses in the Congress. You give the president a veto, right? You give the courts a role in interpreting and potentially even blocking unconstitutional legislation. And as many of you've mentioned, it's really hard to pass a law, right, in this country, which is a very strange thing to do if you have a revolutionary faith in the people. But it is a smart thing to do if you think the people are not really the people. Some of you may have heard of this metaphor, which is also often repeated, again, not in these signed readings, but you'll see it in the revolutionary and constitutional discussions, the idea of Odysseus at the mast, right? Remember, Odysseus is going by the sirens. He wants to hear their song. Their song causes people to crash into the rocks. So he ties himself to the mast so he can hear, and then he stuffs wax in the ears of all the rowers. Right? The founders loved this analogy because they thought the Constitution did the same thing, because it was sort of like tying yourself down and preventing you from doing something out of passion until you get past it to the time of reason and then make a decision. So I'm glad you mentioned that. We only have 4 minutes left. And with perfect timing, Mitchell Langbert, who has been waiting so patiently, is the only one his hand up who has not had a chance to speak. So Mitchell, why don't you bring it home for us and explain to us why you do not know how to center your camera properly and instead have distorted everything in the strange world within which you live, where everything is sideways. Go ahead.
I have it sitting on my windowsill and it's kind of tipped over. I can't figure out how to correct it. But anyway, I just to let you know, I teach at Brooklyn College in New York, so I'm part of the the cabal here. But thanks for a wonderful class. It's really been a great learning experience. You mentioned Rome, and I was going to actually, that was one of the things I was going to ask about. Like, the founding fathers had really two great classical models for democracy and republican rule, and that was Athens and Rome, and both of them collapsed because of faction. And especially Rome, I'm sure they knew the classical history well, probably better than I do. But Rome really, the factions in Rome were totally based on class. And I wonder if that's part of what Madison was referring to, and to what degree was Montesquieu's thinking and the founders reacting to that kind of model, that kind of past history. Maybe somebody knows. And the other thing, there were a couple of points, but I'll just throw one out.
Can I interrupt you for 1 second?
Oh yeah, please.
I thought we were only supposed to go 75 minutes, but I've actually been told we have till just about 8:30. So my apologies. You are not going to be the valedictorian, Professor Langbert. We're going to get some more people in, but I just want to make clear, so we have time for a few more comments. So go ahead with your second point.
Second of all, I wonder, a few people in the beginning, and I think you were saying that there was this sort of this American exceptionalism at the founding, and I'm wondering to what degree that's true. To what degree were these kind of liberal Lockean principles that I think are central to our culture? You know, if you recall Lewis Hartz, who really said it was really Locke who sort of made the New Deal more palatable to us. That, in other words, that somehow the New Deal magically incorporated Lockean thinking. I don't really agree with it, but it's kind of an interesting.
Yeah, let me throw the Louis Hart in, this is a question I've been thinking about for a long time, ever since college. This American exceptionalism country, and you don't have to think America is a good place to believe in exceptionalism. It could be exceptionally bad as well, which is sort of the 1619 Project's theory of exceptionalism. But Louis Hart, I think, has been one of the more influential thinkers in the 20th century, and his initial question was, why has no successful socialist party ever arisen in the United States? Now, maybe he just didn't live long enough to see AOC become president. But, if you look at America and Western European countries, they have the same common economic situations. They go through revolution and the Industrial Revolution. And so he said, why? And this is something that puzzled a lot of theorists. Why you see socialism arise, parties arise throughout Western Europe and take power in several countries, including Great Britain, the one we are the closest to in terms of history and tradition, never gets off the ground in a serious way in the United States. So Hart says there's something exceptional about the United States. And for those of you who are interested, there's a current writer who is named Seymour Martin Lipset, who's written some very interesting books about why America is exceptional. Eventually, he comes back, and this brings us back to some of the earlier points that Kirsten and Johnny Davis brought up. He thinks it's religion is one of the big differences between America and Europe that makes us exceptional. But Hart's view was we got trapped by the Constitution into this lock-in natural, and this goes to several of the other things several of you said, natural rights way of thinking about individual rights and property. And we have federalism and the separation of powers. And so Hart says the Constitution prevented us from becoming a socialist country. You can't have the concentration of power you need in a single government to be able to effectively run a socialist country. This was Hart's argument. So he tried to say it was a combination of Locke and the Constitution that keeps America trapped from entering socialist paradise. So it's an interesting sort of take that tied several of the themes together. There was Robert Yellowstone. Are you named after the park? That would be so awesome.
Unfortunately, no, I'm just in the park.
Oh, you're in the park.
I'm in the park.
Wow.
I work for the concessions company, just doing basic stuff.
No, really? You work at Yellowstone for the concessions?
I do.
Awesome. You have the most interesting job of anyone that's ever appeared in any of these sessions.
This is
the only one that could be of any help to me, because I want to get an annual parking pass, if you don't mind.
Well, unfortunately, I don't work for the Park Service.
and actually, they don't. I don't think they exist either. So, but go ahead. Go ahead.
It's the most wonderful place in the United States. I wonder if I could divert the conversation a little bit onto something in what I think is in the readings. Page 173 of the PDF, where it's the introduction to the Federalist Papers.
Yes.
And he talks about how the Electoral College is going to attract fit characters, and that it will afford a moral certainty that the office of president will seldom fall to the lot of any man who is not an eminent degree endowed with requisite qualifications. I don't know, I might say that, my opinion, that the Electoral College has fallen down very badly on that score over the years. If our current crop of presidents and presidential candidates is any indication. That's my first question. My second question had to do with, and I don't know for sure that this is part of the writings, or the readings, but the expansion of the administrative state. I would love to hear your comments on both of those elements if there is time.
So the first point I think is quite consistent with what several people in the class have said about the dispersion of power. It may not yield the results that the founders had hoped for, but at least you could see in the Electoral College, I think, an effort, right, to get away from pure democracy, a way to, right, it is not, right, who won the 2016 popular vote? Hillary Clinton by 3 million votes, right? Joe Biden won by 10 million, but he really only lost the Electoral College by 75,000 votes spread across 4 states. It is a decidedly non-democratic system. It's not a system that excludes democracy, but like all the other features we've been talking about, it blends democracy with the states, right? Because one of you mentioned earlier that senators were not picked by election until the early 20th century. Our music professor friend, I don't see him on the screen anymore. Oh, yeah, there he is, Richard Fountain, mentioned that. But guess what? Even unchanged to this day is the right of state legislatures to pick the electors. Every state has granted that right to the people, but any state, and the Supreme Court made this clear actually in Bush versus Gore, any state is free to take back that power away from the people and pick the electors themselves if they so choose. Right, so you have that. Then you have every state gets 2 extra electoral votes. Right, so that's another slightly anti-democratic feature that gives some power to, and then the other thing I'd add is that the founders, it seems from the evidence we have, thought that the Electoral College would not often reach a majority as to any particular candidate, right? So they create the Electoral College, like a lot of these features, before political parties. So they thought that the Electoral College would probably tend to represent regional candidates, people well-known, outstanding figures in their communities. And so what happens when we now have had something of an education. What happens when the Electoral College yields no majority? It goes to the House. And but in the House, it's not by majority vote, it's vote by each state, state by state. So you can really see the power of the states in the selection of the president. If the founders had been right, that most elections would have gotten thrown into the House. They turned out to be wrong about that because political parties arose very quickly and started organizing candidates across the states to coordinate their electoral votes. But the original design of the Electoral College, you can see, is part of this dispersion of power, this suspicion of democracy, pure majoritarian democracy that we see in the other provisions of the Constitution. I'm happy, since we only have 8 minutes now, 8 or 9 minutes, I'm happy to throw it open to others who might have views about the administrative state, because Robert's quite right, that does not appear in the Constitution and could be seen as, has been called a great cancer on the Constitution, an effort to evade the Constitution, in fact, though no one has been able to reverse it. And in fact, under presidents of both parties, it just seems to grow and grow. So Beverly Rice, I guess you're in Irvine, California.
Yes, by the way, I love your podcast that you do with Joseph Epstein. I was just listening to it today about the Marbury versus Madison
yeah, so Richard Epstein is my co-host.
Sorry.
Yeah, and he's probably the leading libertarian in America. And the reason, for those of you who've not listened to the podcast, I hope you do. Richard is able to speak in complete paragraphs without any mistakes. He speaks in complete paragraphs. So my sole qualification to become a co-host was I can get him to stop talking. But I'm not going to tell anybody how, because I don't want to lose my little perch there as his co-host. So I'm the only one who can get, otherwise he has another podcast where they ask him one question and he speaks straight for 45 minutes. So.
Anyway, sorry.
That one, by the way, I do not recommend that you listen to. Okay, Beverly.
Okay, so I did want to talk about the administrative state. I wanted to ask you, because if I understand it correctly, President Wilson was the first one to actively run against the Constitution, or to say that it was obsolete and that it needed to, we needed to change it. And so since Wilson, it seems like that has been sort of a prevailing thought among, Democrats. And I just, and so consequently, the administrative state feels like to many people, like they are the ones running the government as opposed to the elected officials. So
yeah, well, one way to think of it is that we've gone through refoundings of the country. So we had the founding, we're talking about the basic structure. The other founding is the reconstruction, right? When individual rights come to the fore, where he's spoken very early on, but we have the discussion in the beginning of natural rights. And it may be a surprise to some of you to learn that states were still free to violate individual rights until after the Civil War. Individual rights are not guaranteed against both levels of government until the Reconstruction. So some people call it a second American founding. Arguably, there was a third one, which was not expressed in constitutional amendments, which was the administrative state. What does the administrative state do? The administrative state quite cleverly evades all the things you guys came up with to disperse power, all the things you did to weaken the government because you are afraid of tyranny. Think about the administrative state evades. It's quite clever. It's so clever, so devilishly clever. Only a professor could come up with it. Woodrow Wilson, the greatest political scientist in American history. I'm not sure that's a good thing, right? He is the founder of the American Political Science Association. His model of good government is German, right? He studies Teutonic theories of government. He goes to Johns Hopkins, which is modeled on German universities. I'm going to go on and on about this. But Wilson's great contributions are still read today, in political science. His theory is the Constitution is too inefficient. The founders went too far in diffusing power. So what we got to do is come up with new structures to overcome those divisions. So one of them, he says, is political parties. He's quite right about this. If you think about what political parties to do, they get presidents and Congresses to cooperate because they belong to the same party. That's not what the founders intended. They wanted the president and Congress to fight if they could. And then the second thing he came up with was, let's give all the power from the legislature, delegate it to independent agencies made up of experts. We have to insulate those experts from politics. Politics is dirty and corrupting. And so he creates this engine, the agency, which continuously makes laws. You don't have to go through the House and the Senate and through only those limited areas of federal power that you were all talking about. And instead, you delegate large power to the agencies and they just continuously make regulations, right? They kind of bypass the separation of powers. And then you marry, the third thing is relatively unlimited national power. And so the states are no longer a bulwark against these agencies. And I would say, not to end on a depressing note, but we live in Wilson's country, don't we? I mean, Wilson won. I mean, his ideas won. And if you look at the way our government is today, the way most Americans think about their rights, and where they look at, we started out with the source of authority. Who was more popular during the lockdowns? The elected president of the United States or an unelected bureaucrat named Dr. Tony Fauci, right? That shows you the power of Wilson's vision. But Wilson, and I know this, Beverly's quite right, Wilson explicitly said this was to fix the errors of the Constitution, which he saw as defective. He said it was not suited to the industrial age and so had to be corrected. So it was more like those nice European styles of government that he admired so much. And he persuaded enough people to go along with. Now, some people say, yes, Wilson did that, but then after World War I, it went back to a normal system. And then it was really FDR that made it permanent. And I think there's some truth to that too. So let me turn it back over to Chris, because I don't want to end on that. That might sound unduly pessimistic. I am not a pessimist about this great American experiment of ours at all. But sometimes it helps to see how far we have changed from the beginning vision to see how much we have to do to get it back, I think, to that original vision too. So,
no, I concur.
Chris.
I think it's instructive to end on that note to see where we've come from. And everyone, please, join me in giving Professor John Yu a great round of applause for guiding us through tonight's discussion.
Thank you.
The readings were somewhat dense, and I think he did a great job of kind of getting us from point A to point where we are in the country currently. So that's not an easy task in 90 minutes. So John, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks everybody for a wonderful discussion. And sorry I didn't get to everybody. I see some of you are in a very relaxed state, which was not my intention. I'm looking at you, John H. in Florida, you and your wife sitting there cuddling on the couch. That's the last thing I ever see in any law school class. It's almost
Next
insulting.
week we are back, everyone, the same time, same place. The discussion will be economic freedom and political freedom with Bobby Herzberg, who runs the F.A. Hayek program at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. I think it'll be a great conversation. We'll be looking forward to seeing you all then. John, thanks again. Thank you all, and we'll see you next week.